I never thought my life would change so dramatically in a single day. It was a Friday, just like any other, or so I believed. I remember the weight of exhaustion on my shoulders as I walked through the front door of our modest suburban home in Springfield, Missouri. The scent of fresh-cut grass from our neighbor's yard mixed with the earthy aroma of the approaching thunderstorm. I had just finished my shift at Johnson's Bookkeeping, where I'd been working part-time for the past 3 years. As I hung up my light jacket and kicked off my sensible flats, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of the weekend ahead. Aaron and I had plans to drive out to Table Rock Lake, maybe do some fishing or just relax by the water. It was something we'd been looking forward to all week, a chance to reconnect and unwind from the stresses of daily life. I found Aaron seated at our old oak dining table, the one we'd bought at a yard sale when we first moved in together. His sandy hair was slightly mussed, and his blue eyes were fixed on his phone screen, thumb scrolling absently. He looked up as I entered, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, Em," he said, setting his phone down. "How was work?" I sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Same old, same old. Mr. Johnson's still trying to get everyone to switch to the new accounting software. Half the office is in revolt. Aaron chuckled, but it seemed a bit forced. I noticed a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there this morning. "Everything okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch his hand. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I got a call from Sarah earlier." Sarah was Aaron's younger sister. She'd always been a bit of a free spirit, bouncing from job to job and relationship to relationship. Last I'd heard, she was going through a messy divorce with her husband of 2 years. "Is she all right?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. Aaron ran a hand through his hair, a habit he had when he was stressed. "Not really. The divorce is final, but she's drowning in debt. Her ex left her with a mountain of bills, and she's struggling to keep her head above water." My heart went out to Sarah. We'd never been particularly close, but she was family. "That's terrible. Is there anything we can do to help?" The moment the words left my mouth, I saw something shift in Aaron's expression. It was subtle, but I'd known him for 10 years, married for 6 of those, and I could read him like a book. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on an odd tone, "I've been thinking about that. You know that inheritance you got from your grandfather last month?" I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. My grandfather, Pop as I'd always called him, had passed away earlier in the year. He'd left me a substantial sum, not millions, but enough to make a real difference in our lives. We'd talked about using it as a down payment on a house, maybe starting a family. "What about it?" I asked cautiously. Aaron leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I was thinking we could use some of it to help Sarah pay off her debts. Get her back on her feet, you know?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. The idea of using Pop's money he'd worked his whole life to save, money he'd entrusted to me, to bail out Sarah's financial troubles, it felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal. "Aaron," I started, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry, but that money, it's not just money. It's Pop's legacy. He left it to me for our future, for our family." I watched as Aaron's expression darkened. The lines around his mouth deepened, and his eyes took on a hard glint that I'd never seen before. "How can you be so selfish?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "My sister is drowning, and you're sitting here hoarding money like some kind of miser." His words hit me like a physical blow. Selfish? Is that really what he thought of me? "I'm not being selfish," I protested, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "That money is for our future, Aaron. For the family we've talked about starting. It's not just about the money, it's about respecting Pop's wishes." Aaron stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He towered over me, his face contorted with anger. "Respect? You want to talk about respect? Where's your respect for my family? For me?" I stood up too, refusing to be intimidated. "Your family is my family too, Aaron. But this isn't the way to help Sarah. We can figure out another way to dash." I never got to finish that sentence. In a flash of movement that my brain could barely process, Aaron's hand struck my face. The sound of the slap echoed in our small kitchen, followed by a deafening silence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I stood there, frozen, my hand instinctively rising to my stinging cheek. I could feel the heat of the mark he'd left, both physical and emotional. Tears blurred my vision as I stared at Aaron, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Aaron seemed just as shocked as I was. For a split second, I saw a flicker of remorse in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by something else, a cold, hard look that I'd never seen before. He pointed a finger at me, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you deny me?" he hissed. The words dripped with entitlement and rage, a toxic combination that made my stomach churn. Without another word, he grabbed his work bag from the counter and stormed out of the house. The slam of the front door reverberated through the empty rooms, leaving me alone in the aftermath of what had just transpired. I sank back into my chair, my mind reeling. How had this happened? How had a conversation about helping family turned into this? I touched my cheek again, wincing at the tenderness. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt, it was the shattering of trust, the sudden realization that the man I had loved and trusted for a decade was capable of this. As the shock began to wear off, other emotions started to surface. Anger, fear, confusion, they all swirled together in a maelstrom of feelings that threatened to overwhelm me. But beneath it all, there was something else. A spark of determination, a steel core of resolve that I didn't even know I possessed. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky but my mind growing clearer by the second. This wasn't right. This wasn't okay. And I wouldn't, let it stand. I walked to our bedroom, my steps growing more purposeful with each passing moment. As I opened the closet and pulled out my old suitcase, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was it. The turning point. The moment where I decided that I deserved better than this. As I began to pack, memories flooded my mind. The day Aaron and I met at a local coffee shop, bonding over our shared love of mystery novels. Our first date at the Springfield Art Museum, where we spent hours discussing the exhibits and our dreams for the future. The proposal at Top of the Rock, overlooking Table Rock Lake at sunset. The small, intimate wedding in my parents' backyard, surrounded by friends and family. Where had it all gone wrong? Had there been signs that I'd missed? Looking back, I could see moments of possessiveness, of control, that I'd brushed off as protectiveness. Times when he'd made decisions for both of us without consulting me, always with the excuse that he knew what was best. As I folded clothes and gathered important documents, I realized that this wasn't just about today. This was about years of subtle manipulation, of slowly eroding my sense of self. Today's events weren't an anomaly, they were the culmination of a pattern I'd been too blind to see. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from James Madison, my attorney. We had a meeting scheduled for next week to discuss safeguarding my inheritance, a meeting I'd set up without telling Aaron, driven by a nagging sense of unease I couldn't quite explain at the time. I looked around the bedroom one last time, memories hanging in the air like dust motes caught in sunlight. This room, this house, it had been our haven, our shared dream. Now, it felt cold and alien, tainted by the events of the past hour. With my suitcase in one hand and my car keys in the other, I walked through the house for what I knew would be the last time. In the kitchen, I paused, looking at the table where everything had fallen apart. On a sudden impulse, I grabbed a notepad and pen, scribbling a short note, "Don't look for me. This was your doing." I taped it to the kitchen counter, where I knew Aaron would see it. The words felt final, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. As I walked out the front door, the first drops of rain from the approaching storm began to fall. It felt fitting somehow, as if the sky itself was mourning the end of what I had once thought was a perfect love story. I threw my suitcase in the trunk of my car and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, as the reality of what I was doing washed over me. I was leaving. Walking away from 10 years of my life, from the future I thought I had all planned out. But as I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, I felt something unexpected, relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. As I merged onto the highway, heading towards the downtown Holiday Inn where I'd booked a room under my middle name, Jane, I allowed myself a small smile. This wasn't the end. This was a beginning. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The Springfield skyline loomed ahead, familiar yet somehow new. As I drove towards my uncertain future, one thought kept repeating in my mind: I am strong. I am worthy. And I will not be broken. The sound of Aaron's car faded into the distance as I sat in the Holiday Inn parking lot, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. The enormity of what I'd just done washed over me in waves. I'd left. I'd actually left. The life I'd built over the past decade was now behind me, shattered by a single moment of violence and years of subtle manipulation I'd been too blind to see. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The air conditioning in the car was on full blast, a stark contrast to the humid Missouri summer night outside. I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My cheek was still red from where Aaron had struck me, a visual reminder of why I couldn't go back. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the confirmation email for my room reservation. Jane Smith, it read. My middle name and my maiden name, a small act of rebellion and self-preservation. I gathered my courage and stepped out of the car, the warm night air enveloping me like a blanket. The lobby of the Holiday Inn was blessedly cool and quiet. The night clerk, a young man with kind eyes, looked up as I approached the desk. Checking in, he asked with a smile. I nodded, not trusting my voice. As he processed my reservation, I couldn't help but wonder if he could see the turmoil behind my eyes, if the bruise forming on my cheek was as visible as it felt. Here you go, Ms. Smith, he said, handing me a keycard. Room 314. If you need anything, just dial 0 for the front desk. I managed a weak smile and a quiet thank you before heading to the elevator. Room 314. Pi. A number that goes on forever, never repeating. Somehow, it felt fitting for this new, uncertain chapter of my life. The room was standard hotel fare, a queen-sized bed, a desk, a small sitting area. But to me, it felt like a sanctuary. I set my suitcase down and sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with me. The tears I'd been holding back since leaving the house came in a flood, and I let them fall freely. I cried for the life I thought I had. For the future I'd planned with Aaron. For the love I thought was unshakable. But most of all, I cried for myself, for the woman who had slowly lost herself in a relationship that had become toxic without her even realizing it. As the tears subsided, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was scared, yes, but I was also free. For the first time in years, I didn't have to consider anyone else's feelings or desires but my own. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I pulled out my phone, staring at the blank screen. No missed calls. No text messages. Part of me had expected, hoped, even, that Aaron would have reached out by now. To apologize, to beg me to come home, to show some sign that he regretted what he'd done. But there was nothing. Instead, I had a notification from my email. It was from James Madison, my attorney, confirming our meeting next week. I'd scheduled it on a whim, driven by a nagging sense of unease about my inheritance. Now, that meeting felt like a lifeline. I opened my laptop and typed out a quick email to James, asking if we could move the meeting up. To my surprise, I got an almost immediate response. He could see me tomorrow afternoon. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. At least I had a plan, a next step to focus on. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, replaying the events of the day in my mind. The look in Aaron's eyes as he raised his hand. The sound of the slap echoing in our kitchen. The cold, hard tone of his voice as he demanded access to my inheritance. My inheritance. Pop's legacy. I thought about my grandfather, about the stories he used to tell me of growing up during the Great Depression. How he'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, how he'd built his business from the ground up. He'd left me that money not just as a financial gift, but as a testament to his life's work, his values. You've got grit, Emily, he used to tell me, his eyes twinkling. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you. As dawn broke over Springfield, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself and to Pop's memory. I wouldn't let anyone, Not even Aaron, take away my grit, my self-respect, or my future. The next morning, I woke early, feeling more resolute than I had in years. I showered, dressed in one of the professional outfits I'd hastily packed, and headed down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. As I sipped my coffee and picked at a plate of eggs and toast, I started making lists in my notebook. Things I needed to do. People I needed to contact. Questions I needed to ask James. By the time I walked into James Madison's office that afternoon, I felt prepared. Not confident, exactly, but ready to face whatever came next. James was a kind-faced man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Pop-Pop's attorney for years, and I'd always felt comfortable around him. Today, though, I was grateful for his professional demeanor. I didn't want pity, I wanted action. "Emily," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "I was surprised to get your email. Is everything all right?" I took a deep breath. "No, James. Everything is not all right." Over the next hour, I poured out the whole story. The argument with Aaron. The slap. The demand for my inheritance. My hasty departure. James listened without interrupting, his expression grave. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "First of all, Emily, I want you to know that you did the right thing by leaving. What Aaron did was assault, plain and simple." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Hearing someone else say it, assault, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Now," James continued, "let's talk about your inheritance. The good news is, it's ironclad. Your grandfather was very clear in his will that the money was to go to you and you alone. Aaron has no legal claim to it whatsoever." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. So he can't touch it? Not legally, no. But Emily, I have to ask, do you think he might try to access it anyway? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Would Aaron do that? A week ago, I would have said no without hesitation. But now, I don't know, I admitted. I don't think I know him at all anymore. James nodded, his expression sympathetic but determined. Then we need to take steps to protect you and your assets. I'm going to recommend we freeze your joint accounts immediately. We'll also need to start the process of separating your finances completely. As James outlined the steps we needed to take, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness at the final dissolution of my marriage. Fear of what Aaron might do when he realized I wasn't coming back. But underneath it all, a growing sense of empowerment. I was taking control of my life, my future. We spent the next few hours going over paperwork, making phone calls, setting things in motion. By the time I left James's office, the sun was setting over Springfield, casting long shadows across the streets. I walked back to my car, my mind buzzing with everything we'd discussed. Divorce papers. Restraining orders. Financial separation. It was overwhelming, but I felt stronger than I had in years. I had a plan. I had support. I had hope. As I drove back to the hotel, I passed by familiar landmarks. The Springfield Art Museum where Aaron and I had our first date. The park where we used to have picnics on lazy Sunday afternoons. The coffee shop where we'd meet for quick lunches during busy workdays. Each place held memories, but they no longer felt like shackles. They were just places now, parts of a city I was seeing with new eyes. Back in my hotel room, I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically, but there was one more thing I needed to do. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping at a name I hadn't called in far too long. "Hello." The familiar voice on the other end of the line brought tears to my eyes. "Maggie, it's Emily. I need your help." As I started to explain the situation to my oldest friend, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about leaving Aaron. It wasn't just about protecting my inheritance. This was about reclaiming my life, my identity, my power. And I was ready to fight for it. The days that followed my conversation with James Madison blurred together in a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. The Holiday Inn had become my temporary home, a neutral space where I could gather my thoughts and plan my next moves. Each morning, I'd wake up and for a split second, I'd forget everything that had happened. Then reality would come crashing back, and I'd have to summon the strength to face another day. It was on one of these mornings, as I sat at the small desk in my room sipping mediocre hotel coffee, that my phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. Mr. Reynolds, my grandfather's trusted legal advisor, wanted to speak with me urgently. I hesitated for a moment before calling him back, unsure of what to expect. "Emily, my dear," Mr. Reynolds's familiar voice came through the line, warm and comforting like a well-worn blanket. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Reynolds," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Mr. Reynolds spoke again, his tone was grave. "I've heard about what happened with Aaron. James Madison filled me in on the situation. I wanted to check in on you and offer my assistance." I felt a lump form in my throat. The genuine concern in his voice brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I managed to say. "It's been challenging." "I can only imagine," he said softly. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Emily. The strength you're showing in the face of adversity, that's pure Charlie Roberts right there." The mention of my grandfather's name brought a smile to my face, despite everything. "I'm trying to live up to his example," I said. "And you're doing a fine job of it," Mr. Reynolds assured me. "Now, let's talk about your inheritance. I want you to know that Aaron won't be able to touch those funds. Not legally, anyway." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. James said the same thing, but it's reassuring to hear it from you too. "Good," Mr. Reynolds said firmly. "We've got your back, Emily. Your grandfather made sure of that. Now, is there anything else you need? Anything at all?" As I thanked Mr. Reynolds and ended the call, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had people in my corner, people who believed in me and were willing to help. With that thought in mind, I decided it was time to reach out to the people I'd distanced myself from during my marriage. Friends and family who had tried to warn me about Aaron's controlling tendencies, people I'd pushed away in my misguided attempt to be a good wife. The first person on my list was Maggie, my childhood best friend. We'd grown up together in Springfield, sharing everything from our first day of kindergarten to our high school graduation. But over the years, as Aaron had become increasingly possessive, I'd let our friendship fade. With shaking hands, I dialed her number, half expecting it to go straight to voicemail. To my surprise, she picked up on the second ring. "Emily?" Maggie's voice was a mix of surprise and concern. "Is everything okay?" "No," I admitted, my voice cracking. "No, it's not. Maggie, I left Aaron." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I feared I'd made a mistake in calling. Then Maggie spoke, her voice filled with a fierce determination that I remembered so well from our youth. "Tell me everything," she said. "And then we're going to figure out how to make this right." Over the next hour, I poured out the whole story to Maggie. The argument, the slap, the demands for my inheritance. With each word, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Maggie listened without interrupting, only occasionally making sounds of sympathy or outrage. When I finally finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Maggie said, in a tone that brooked no argument, "I'm coming to get you. Pack your bags. You're not staying in that hotel another night." "Maggie, I can't impose." I started to protest, but she cut me off. "Emily Jane Roberts," she said, using my full name in a way that transported me back to our teenage years, "you are not imposing. You are my best friend, and you need help. Let me help you." Tears welled up in my eyes, but for the first time in days, they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Okay," I whispered. "Thank you." An hour later, I was sitting in Maggie's sleek SUV, my suitcase in the trunk, heading towards her apartment in downtown Springfield. As we drove, Maggie filled me in on her life. She was now a corporate lawyer with a reputation for being a fierce advocate for her clients. "Emily," she said as we pulled into her apartment complex, "we're going to make sure you come out of this not just okay, but stronger than ever. You're untouchable. You hear me?" I nodded, feeling a spark of hope ignite in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. Over the next few days, Maggie's apartment became my war room. We spread papers across her dining table, making lists and plans. Maggie insisted on hiring a private investigator to look into Aaron's financial history. If he's been so controlling about money, she reasoned, there's a good chance he's been hiding things from you. I was hesitant at first, but Maggie's determination won me over. The PI, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa, got to work immediately. It was a week later when Lisa called us with her findings. Maggie and I huddled around the phone, listening intently as Lisa laid out what she'd discovered. "Emily," Lisa said, her voice professional but tinged with sympathy, "I'm afraid there's quite a bit here that you weren't aware of." As Lisa detailed her findings, I felt the blood drain from my face. Aaron had been mismanaging our joint finances for years. He'd been using my earnings not just for his own expenses, but to quietly support his sister in ways I'd never agreed to. There were records of loans he'd taken out in his name, debts I'd known nothing about. "But that's not all," Lisa continued. "There's evidence that he's been looking into ways to access your inheritance. He's been in contact with some less than reputable individuals who specialize in financial fraud." I felt sick to my stomach. The man I'd loved, the man I'd built a life with, had been lying to me all along. And now he was potentially planning to steal from me. Maggie's hand found mine under the table, squeezing it reassuringly. "Thank you, Lisa," she said into the phone. "Send us everything you've got. We'll take it from here." After we hung up, Maggie turned to me, her eyes blazing with determination. "Emily, listen to me. What Aaron's done, what he's planning to do, it's not just morally wrong. It's illegal. We've got him." I nodded, still trying to process everything I'd just learned. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Maggie's smile was fierce. Now we fight back. We're going to use every bit of evidence we have to make sure Aaron never comes near you or your money again. And we're going to do it all legally, above board. He won't know what hit him." As Maggie outlined our next steps, meetings with lawyers, filing for divorce, securing restraining orders, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger, of course, at Aaron's betrayal. Fear of what he might do when he realized I knew everything. But underneath it all, there was a growing sense of strength. I thought about my grandfather, about the grit and determination he'd shown in building his life from nothing. I thought about Mr. Reynolds and James Madison, standing ready to protect what Pop had entrusted to me. I thought about Maggie, jumping into action to help me without a second thought. And I realized something important. I wasn't just a victim in this story. I was a survivor. And with the support of these unexpected allies, I was going to reclaim my life and my future. As the sun set over Springfield, casting a warm glow through Maggie's apartment windows, I stood up, squared my shoulders, and said, "Okay. Let's do this. Let's show Aaron that he messed with the wrong woman." Maggie's answering grin was all the confirmation I needed. We had a long road ahead, but for the first time since that fateful day in my kitchen, I felt truly, unequivocally ready to face whatever came next. The Emily who had let herself be controlled and manipulated was gone. In her place stood a woman who was ready to fight for herself, for her inheritance, and for the future she deserved. And heaven help anyone who tried to stand in her way. A week had passed since my conversation with Maggie and the revelations from the private investigator. Each day had been a whirlwind of preparations, strategy sessions, and moments of doubt that I pushed aside with growing determination. Now, as I stood in front of the house I once shared with Aaron, I felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside me. The familiar red brick facade and neatly trimmed lawn seemed unchanged, as if the past weeks had been nothing but a fever dream. But I knew better. I was changed, and after today, nothing would ever be the same. I wasn't alone. Standing beside me were two men who had become integral to my fight: Reynolds, my grandfather's attorney, and Lucas, the sharp-eyed private investigator who had uncovered Aaron's financial deceit. Their presence gave me strength, reminding me that I wasn't facing this battle on my own. "Are you ready, Emily?" Reynolds asked, his voice gentle but firm. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the crisp blouse I'd chosen for this confrontation. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. We'd timed our arrival carefully, knowing Aaron's routine. Sure enough, Just as we approached the front door, I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart raced, but I stood my ground. Aaron emerged from his car, keys jangling in his hand. He froze mid-step when he saw us, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into barely contained anger. But what caught me off guard was the figure that stepped out of the passenger side, Sarah, Aaron's sister. For a moment, we all stood in a tableau of tension. Then Aaron broke the silence, his voice tight with forced casualness. "Emily, this is unexpected. Who are your friends?" I squared my shoulders, drawing strength from the men beside me. "Aaron, we need to talk. These are Mr. Reynolds, my grandfather's attorney, and Lucas, a private investigator." Aaron's eyes narrowed, darting between me and my companions. "A private investigator? What the hell is going on, Emily?" "I think you know exactly what's going on," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "We're here to discuss your financial mismanagement and your plans regarding my inheritance." Sarah, who had been hovering uncertainly by the car, stepped forward. "What's she talking about, Aaron? What inheritance?" I felt a pang of sympathy for Sarah. It was clear from her confusion that she wasn't fully aware of what Aaron had been doing. But I couldn't let that distract me from why we were here. "Let's take this inside," Reynolds suggested, his tone leaving no room for argument. As we filed into the house, I was struck by how different it felt. The furniture was the same, the photos still hung on the walls, but it no longer felt like home. It was just a house now, filled with memories I was ready to leave behind. We gathered in the living room, an awkward grouping of people who should have been family but now felt like strangers. Aaron and Sarah sat on the couch, while Reynolds, Lucas, and I took chairs opposite them. "All right," Aaron said, his jaw clenched. "What's this all about?" Reynolds took charge, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Carter, we're here because we've uncovered some disturbing information about your financial activities. Specifically, your mismanagement of joint finances and your attempts to access Mrs. Carter's inheritance." Aaron's face paled, but he quickly recovered. "That's ridiculous. Emily, you can't seriously believe this nonsense." I met his gaze steadily. "I've seen the evidence, Aaron. The loans you took out without my knowledge, the way you've been funneling money to support Sarah without discussing it with me, and your recent inquiries about accessing my inheritance. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Sarah gasped, looking at her brother with a mix of shock and betrayal. "Aaron, what have you done?" Lucas stepped in, his voice matter-of-fact. "We have documentation of all of Mr. Carter's financial activities over the past 5 years. Bank statements, loan applications, communications with certain individuals specializing in financial fraud. It's quite comprehensive." Aaron's composure cracked. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You had no right to dig into my personal affairs. This is invasion of privacy." "On the contrary," Reynolds countered, "as Mrs. Carter's legal representative, we had every right to investigate joint financial matters, especially given the circumstances of their separation." I watched Aaron's reaction carefully. The man I saw before me was a far cry from the person I thought I had married. His eyes darted around the room, like a cornered animal looking for escape. When he spoke again, his voice was a mix of desperation and anger. "Emily, you don't understand. Everything I did was for us, for our family. Sarah needed help, and that inheritance, it could solve all our problems. Why are you being so selfish?" The word selfish hit me like a physical blow, echoing our last confrontation. But this time, instead of shrinking away, I felt a surge of righteous anger. "Selfish?" I repeated, my voice low but intense. "Is it selfish to want to honor my grandfather's wishes? Is it selfish to expect honesty from my husband? You lied to me, Aaron. You manipulated our finances, made decisions that affected both of us without my input, and then had the audacity to demand access to my inheritance. That's not love, that's control." Sarah, who had been silent, suddenly spoke up. "I had no idea," she said, her voice shaky. "Aaron told me you had agreed to help. If I had known." I felt a twinge of sympathy for her. "It's not your fault, Sarah. You're as much a victim in this as I am." Aaron's face contorted with rage. Victim? You're calling yourself a victim? After everything I've done for you? He took a step towards me, his hands clenched into fists. In that moment, I saw again the man who had struck me in our kitchen, and I flinched involuntarily. Lucas was on his feet in an instant, positioning himself between Aaron and me. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and warning. The tension in the room was palpable. Aaron looked from Lucas to me, then to Reynolds, who was calmly pulling papers from his briefcase. "What are those?" Aaron demanded, his voice hoarse. "Divorce papers," Reynolds replied. "Along with a detailed account of your financial misdeeds and a restraining order." Aaron's face drained of color. "You can't be serious. Emily, please, we can work this out. I love you." I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve firm. "No, Aaron. We can't work this out. What you did, it wasn't love. It was abuse. Financial, emotional, and ultimately physical. I won't let you control me anymore." I turned to Reynolds. "What do we do now?" Reynolds handed Aaron the thick manila envelope. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you review these documents with a lawyer. Any attempts to access Mrs. Carter's funds or contact her directly will result in legal action." Aaron took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, hard stare. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've won? You're nothing without me, Emily. Nothing." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I stood my ground. "No, Aaron. I'm everything without you. I'm myself again, and that's worth more than anything you could ever offer." With that, I turned and walked out of the house, Reynolds and Lucas close behind. As we stepped into the warm Springfield afternoon, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The confrontation had been difficult, even frightening at times, but it was over. As we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. It was no longer my home, no longer my prison. It was just a building, shrinking in the rearview mirror as I drove towards my future. The road ahead was still uncertain. I knew Aaron wouldn't give up easily, that there would be more battles to fight. But for the first time in years, I felt truly free. I had reclaimed my voice, my power, and my sense of self. As we turned onto the highway, heading back to Maggie's apartment where she was waiting anxiously for news, I allowed myself a small smile. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was the author of my own life. The sun was setting over Springfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, a reminder that even after the darkest nights, dawn always comes. And I was ready to embrace whatever the new day might bring. The days following the confrontation with Aaron were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and emotional upheaval. I found myself oscillating between moments of fierce determination and periods of doubt and fear. But through it all, I clung to the knowledge that I was doing the right thing for myself, for my future, and for the memory of my grandfather. It was a crisp autumn morning when I received the call from Reynolds. Aaron had responded to our legal actions, and it wasn't pretty. He was contesting everything, the divorce, the financial disclosures, even the restraining order. Reynolds's voice was grave as he delivered the news. "Emily, he's not going to make this easy," he said. "Are you prepared for what might come next?" I took a deep breath, looking out the window of Maggie's apartment at the trees turning golden in the Springfield sunlight. "I have to be," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "What's our next move?" Reynolds explained that we needed to meet to discuss our strategy. An hour later, I found myself sitting in his office, surrounded by Maggie, Lucas, and James Madison. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily in the air. "Aaron's claiming that you're blowing everything out of proportion," James began, his tone professional but tinged with concern. "He's arguing that as your husband, he had every right to manage your joint finances as he saw fit." I felt a surge of anger at Aaron's audacity. But what about the loans he took out without my knowledge? The money he funneled to his sister? Lucas chimed in, his voice calm and factual. "We have solid evidence of all of that. But Emily, you need to be prepared. Aaron's lawyer is good, one of the best in Springfield. They're going to try to paint you as overreacting, maybe even unstable. The word unstable hit me like a punch to the gut. It was exactly the kind of tactic Aaron would use to make me doubt myself, to make others doubt me. For a moment, I felt that old familiar fear creeping in. What if people believed him? What if I couldn't prove what he'd done? Maggie must have sensed my distress because she reached out and squeezed my hand. Look at me, she said, her voice firm. You are not overreacting. You are not unstable. You are strong, and you are right. We have the truth on our side, and we're going to fight with everything we've got. Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink of doubt. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. You're right. So what do we do? The next few hours were spent strategizing. We pored over financial records, legal precedents, and character witnesses. Reynolds and James worked on our legal approach, while Lucas compiled a comprehensive report of his findings. Maggie, ever the fierce advocate, worked on preparing me for what was to come. You need to be ready for anything, she warned. Aaron's going to try to rattle you, to make you doubt yourself. But remember, you know the truth. Stand firm in that. As the day wore on, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. This wasn't just about the money anymore, or even about the betrayal. This was about standing up for myself, about refusing to be manipulated and controlled any longer. It was late afternoon when we finally wrapped up our session. As we were gathering our things, Reynolds's phone rang. His face grew serious as he listened, and my heart sank. I knew that whatever news he was receiving, it wasn't good. That was my contact at the courthouse, he said after hanging up. Aaron's lawyer has filed for an emergency hearing. They're claiming that you're a flight risk and that you're trying to hide assets. They want to freeze all your accounts, including your inheritance. The room fell silent. This was Aaron's move to try to cut me off financially, to leave me vulnerable and dependent. It was manipulative, it was cruel, and it was exactly what I should have expected from him. For a moment, I felt that old fear creeping in again. But then I looked around the room at the people who had stood by me, who had fought for me. I thought of my grandfather, of his strength and his belief in me. And I made a decision. Let them try, I said, my voice low but firm. I'm done running. I'm done hiding. If Aaron wants a fight, then that's exactly what he's going to get. The next morning found us at the Springfield County Courthouse. The atmosphere was tense as we waited for the hearing to begin. I sat between Maggie and Reynolds, trying to project a calm I didn't entirely feel. When Aaron walked in with his lawyer, a sleek, shark-like woman in an expensive suit, I felt my heart race. But I refused to look away. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, called the court to order. Aaron's lawyer went first, spinning a tale of a distraught husband worried about his unstable wife, of joint assets at risk, of a marriage falling apart due to misunderstandings and overreactions. I listened, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, as she painted me as erratic, as ungrateful, as someone trying to cheat her hard-working husband out of his fair share. With each word, I felt my anger growing, not just at Aaron but at a system that would allow such blatant manipulation. When it was our turn, Reynolds stood, his voice calm and authoritative. He presented the evidence we had gathered, the financial records, the loans, the secret transfers. He spoke of Aaron's attempt to access my inheritance, of the years of financial and emotional manipulation. Your Honor, he concluded, what we have here is not a misunderstanding. It is a clear pattern of financial abuse and control. Mrs. Carter is not hiding assets or fleeing. She is standing her ground, asserting her rights, and seeking justice. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. When both sides had presented their cases, she called for a brief recess to review the evidence. Those 15 minutes were some of the longest of my life. I sat there, trying to breathe steadily, trying not to let the doubt and fear overwhelm me. Maggie held my hand, her presence a silent but powerful support. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze sharp and assessing. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she began, I find no justification for freezing Mrs. Carter's assets. The financial records clearly show a pattern of mismanagement and unauthorized transactions on Mr. Carter's part. Furthermore, the inheritance in question was left specifically to Mrs. Carter and is not a marital asset. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, so strong it was almost dizzying. But the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Carter," she continued, her tone stern, "I am deeply troubled by the evidence presented here today. Your attempts to control and manipulate your wife's finances are unacceptable. The restraining order will remain in place, and I am ordering a full audit of all your financial activities over the past 5 years." She turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Carter, you have shown remarkable courage in standing up for yourself. The court recognizes the difficulty of your situation and commends your resolve." As we left the courtroom, I felt as though a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Aaron's attempt to regain control had backfired spectacularly. For the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to believe that I might truly be free. Outside, in the crisp autumn air, I turned to my team, to Maggie, Reynolds, Lucas, and James. These people who had fought for me, who had believed in me when I struggled to believe in myself. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Maggie pulled me into a fierce hug. "You did this, Em," she said. "We just had your back. And we always will." As we walked down the courthouse steps, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was still long, the divorce proceedings, the continued legal battles, the emotional healing I knew I needed to do. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that journey. I was Emily Carter. I was strong. I was free. And I was ready to face whatever came next. The autumn sun was warm on my face as we headed towards Maggie's car. Springfield, the city I had called home for so long, suddenly felt new and full of possibilities. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The weeks following the courtroom victory were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. As the golden hues of autumn gave way to the crisp chill of a Missouri winter, I found myself navigating a landscape that was at once familiar and entirely new. Springfield, the city I'd called home for so long, seemed to reveal new facets of itself daily, mirroring my own journey of rediscovery. The divorce proceedings moved forward swiftly, thanks to the airtight legal preparation Reynolds and James had put into place. Aaron, his attempts at manipulation thwarted by the judge's decision, retreated into a sullen silence. His lawyer, recognizing the strength of our case, began to push for a settlement rather than a protracted legal battle. I remember sitting in Reynolds's office, poring over the terms of the settlement. The mahogany desk was covered in papers, each one a testament to the life I was leaving behind and the future I was claiming for myself. "Emily," Reynolds said, his voice gentle but firm, "this settlement is more than fair. Aaron will have no claim to your inheritance, and the division of assets clearly favors you, given his financial misconduct." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. It wasn't sadness I felt, but a complex mix of relief, vindication, and a touch of melancholy for the years I'd lost. "What about his sister?" I asked, thinking of Sarah's confused face at our confrontation. James, who had been quietly reviewing documents in the corner, spoke up. "Sarah won't be impacted by this settlement. However, she did reach out to us." He paused, gauging my reaction. "She wanted to apologize. She says she had no idea of the extent of Aaron's actions." I felt a wave of sympathy for Sarah. In many ways, she had been as much a victim of Aaron's manipulations as I had been. "Can you let her know that I don't blame her?" I said softly. "And that I hope she's doing okay?" Reynolds nodded, a small smile on his face. "Of course. You know, Emily, your capacity for compassion, even after everything you've been through, is remarkable." His words warmed me, reminding me of similar things my grandfather used to say. Pop had always believed in the power of kindness, even in the face of adversity. I liked to think he would be proud of how I was handling this situation. As winter settled over Springfield, I found myself embarking on a new chapter of my life. The first step was finding a place of my own. After weeks of searching, I found a small but charming apartment in the Rountree neighborhood. It was a far cry from the house I'd shared with Aaron, but as I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, I felt a sense of possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. Maggie, ever the supportive friend, had insisted on helping me move in and decorate. We spent a weekend painting the walls, arguing good-naturedly over color choices and furniture placement. As we sat on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and the smell of fresh paint, Maggie turned to me with a serious expression. She said, her voice soft, I'm so proud of you. You know that, right? What you've done, how far you've come, it's incredible. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I couldn't have done it without you, I replied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Without any of you. Maggie shook her head, a fierce light in her eyes. We supported you, sure. But this. She gestured around the apartment. This was all you. You found your strength, Emily. You stood up for yourself. Don't ever forget that. Her words stayed with me long after she'd left that evening. As I moved through my new space, making it my own, I realized that Maggie was right. I had found my strength. And I was determined to hold on to it. The following months were a period of intense personal growth. With the legal battles behind me and my financial future secure, I found myself with the time and space to explore who I truly was, outside of the constraints of my marriage to Aaron. I started small, rediscovering old passions that I'd let fall by the wayside. I dug out my old sketchbooks and set up a small art corner in my apartment. The act of putting pencil to paper, of watching lines and shapes come to life under my hand, was deeply therapeutic. I wasn't creating masterpieces, but each drawing felt like a step towards reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost. Encouraged by Maggie, I also joined a support group for women who had left abusive relationships. At first, I was hesitant. My experiences with Aaron seemed mild compared to some of the stories I heard. But as I listened and shared, I realized that abuse comes in many forms, and that my journey was just as valid as anyone else's. The group became a lifeline, a place where I could speak freely about my fears, my anger, and my hopes for the future. Through their stories and their support, I began to heal wounds I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was in one of these group sessions that I had an epiphany. We were discussing our plans for the future when I suddenly realized that, for the first time in years, I was excited about what lay ahead. The future wasn't something to fear or to simply endure, it was full of possibilities. Energized by this realization, I threw myself into exploring new opportunities. I enrolled in a night class at Missouri State University, studying business management. It was challenging, balancing work and study, but I found that I thrived on the intellectual stimulation. As spring bloomed across Springfield, bringing with it a sense of renewal, I made another big decision. With the support of James and Reynolds, I decided to use a portion of my inheritance to start a small business. It was a dream I'd had for years but had never pursued, always finding reasons, or having them found for me, why it wasn't the right time. The idea was to open a small art supply store and studio space, where local artists could not only buy materials but also work and teach classes. It combined my love of art with my newfound business knowledge, and the more I planned, the more excited I became. The process of setting up the business was both exhilarating and terrifying. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was taking on too much too soon. But with each obstacle overcome, each small victory achieved, I felt my confidence growing. It was during this time that I received an unexpected call from Sarah, Aaron's sister. She asked if we could meet, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. We met at a small cafe downtown, the awkwardness between us palpable at first. Emily, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, I can't tell you how sorry I am. I had no idea what Aaron was doing, how he was treating you. If I'd known. I reached out and took her hand, surprised by my own gesture. Sarah, it's okay. You're not responsible for Aaron's actions. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know, but I feel like I was part of it, even if I didn't realize. I want you to know that I've cut ties with him. What he did to you, to both of us really, it's unforgivable. As we talked, I felt a weight I didn't know I was carrying lift from my shoulders. Sarah and I would probably never be close friends, but there was a sense of closure in our conversation, a healing of a wound I hadn't realized was still open. The grand opening of my store, Palette and Pine, coincided almost exactly with the finalization of my divorce. It felt fitting somehow, as if the universe was underlining the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The day of the opening, I stood in front of the store, the morning sun warming my face. The sign above the door, hand-painted by a local artist, gleamed in the light. Maggie stood beside me, both of us taking in the moment. "Ready?" she asked, a proud smile on her face. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. "Ready," I replied, and stepped forward to unlock the door. As customers began to trickle in, admiring the carefully curated supplies and the bright, welcoming studio space, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This store, this dream realized, was so much more than just a business. It was a testament to my journey, to the strength I'd found and the future I was building. Later that evening, as I locked up after a successful first day, I paused to look up at the stars twinkling over Springfield. I thought about the long road that had led me here, the challenges I'd faced and overcome. I thought about Aaron, sending up a silent hope that he would find peace and learn from his mistakes. Most of all, I thought about myself, the Emily I had been, the Emily I was now, and the Emily I was still becoming. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities and potential. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it would lead. As I walked home through the familiar streets of Springfield, I felt at peace. This city, which had seen both my darkest moments and my greatest triumphs, no longer felt like a place I was trapped in. It was a launchpad, a foundation from which I could reach for the stars. I was Emily Carter. I was strong. I was free. And my story was far from over.